But I do think one thing that really irks me on the left, and I don't really have a lot of faith in the right, so I'm not, you tend to criticize the people that you line up more, that you care more about, and that would be the Democrats for me. People lost trust in them because the voters were saying there was a concern. There were people across the board saying they had a concern. And the Democrats said, no, 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 over here, look over here. They told the voters what to care about, and they did not listen when the voters said they cared. So these stories come out aren't about beating a dead horse. It's saying if they could have a fair conversation that we heard you, we saw it as they saw it, they'd be gaining some of the voters back to say, okay, we're not going to keep saying that.
Do you agree with that?
It started like any other morning on the VOA roundtable of hosts ready to debate, laugh, and argue. But this time, it spiraled fast. What was supposed to be a calm discussion about the 2024 election turned into a fiery meltdown when someone brought up the elephant in the room, Joe Biden's mental state.
No, I don't. I think that I want to move on from why the Democratic Party lost, and I want to hear from the Democratic Party about how we are going to take our country back and how what they are going to do to combat fascism and what they're going to do to stop the Medicaid cuts that are going on, to stop giving tax cuts to billionaires, to stop taking federal workers' pensions away, to stop taking federal jobs away, to stop taking education away, to stop attacking our institutions, to stopping, you know, why is this Trump administration stopping medical research, cancer? I want to talk about why this administration is giving refugee status to South African white Afrikaners as opposed to Afghans and Ukrainians and people of color. That's what I want to talk about.
The moment his cognitive decline was mentioned, the atmosphere on set shifted, faces stiffened, voices raised. And suddenly, it wasn't just about Biden anymore, it was about what the entire Democratic Party was hiding. Some of the hosts tried to brush it off, calling it a distraction, but others weren't having it.
77% of Americans in 2023 said Joe Biden was too old to run again. And they were told, sit down, shut up, he is the nominee. And then when it became untenable and he stepped aside, they anointed Kamala Harris. There was not a primary, there was not a Democratic process. And then when she lost, they said, don't look backward, we're moving forward, we're not even going to talk about why we didn't listen to you. We had Joe Biden here last week. It was an honor to have him. I think he is a good man. I do not think he could have been president for 4 more years. The hardest job on the planet.
Can this guy be president?
He was elected. I didn't vote for it.
Real quickly, but he also, President Biden took responsibility at this table, which is something that I'm frustrated with the Democrats. He said,
he did take
this falls on me. And I said that was the clearest answer of what people needed to hear.
Alyssa, in particular, wasn't going to sit quietly while her co-host played defense for a man who, she said, shouldn't have been leading the country at all. She called it what it was, a cover-up. And not just any cover-up, but the biggest political scandal in modern American history.
People are quoted in this book of saying they would be boxed out of meetings if they raise concerns, and there's very specific examples. George Clooney goes on the record to Jake Tapper and says he moved mountains. He flew in from Italy to do this record fundraiser for Joe Biden. Joe Biden didn't recognize George Clooney. One of the most recognizable, one of the most recognizable men on the planet. And now that's not a presidential duty. It's not the job. You don't have to recognize George Clooney. But does that give you confidence that in the middle of the night, if China's about to attack us, there's a war breaking out in Iran, that he is the sharpest person to be able to handle that?
Which administration texted war plans to their brother?
The Trump, but it's just like Joe Biden. No, but do we just keep lowering the bar because Trump is bad? Nothing else is bad because Trump is bad?
It's like, well, that can also be true.
Yeah, but I have the ship has sailed. It's out in the ocean somewhere with Biden.
We have Trump
it's over. Get over it.
No, we have Trump because you guys screwed this up. With all due respect.
All right, but does it help?
According to her, the country had been deceived for 4 long years by party leaders, by the media, and by the very people who were supposed to be protecting democracy. By the way, before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and share more intriguing stories. Now let's continue.
I actually think we have Trump because Trump lied to people. I think that's why we have
He won more votes. That is a fact.
I think he lied to his base. I think he told his base that they were going to, their overtime would not be taxed. That was a lie.
Actually, that's in the new tax bill. It's literally in the tax bill in Congress.
They had to fight to put that in. They had to fight to put that back in. He had every intention of taking away that.
That's not
I
true.
don't-
He
I don't-
ran on
I
no
don't-
tax
I
on
don't-
tips, and
I
it's in the
don't-
tax bill.
Yeah, but it wasn't in it originally. I also
being
think
drafted
that a lot of
now.
people are, and Swazi pointed it out that it wasn't in there. I think the other thing that people need to realize is that they were lied to. Federal workers that voted for him, farmers that voted for
Immigrants
him,
that thought
immigrants
he'd
that
fix
voted
the
for him,
border, but-
they were lied to. That is why we have Trump, not because
And I'm going to
of
give
any
you
other driving
Okay, I'm
force.
going to
Because what came next wasn't just a fight on a talk show. It was a full-blown war of words that revealed just how deep the division runs, not just in politics, but right there on national television. Sarah was the first to really push back. She didn't hold back her frustration with the Democratic Party. What bothered her the most was how they completely ignored the concerns of their own voters. People across the country, Democrats, independents, even moderates, were all saying the same thing. Something's wrong with Biden. But instead of listening, the party told them to shut up and look the other way. They tried to control the narrative like a magician saying, "Don't look at the broken trick, look over here at the shiny distraction." Sarah argued that this wasn't about dragging Biden through the mud. It was about honesty. It was about accountability. If the Democrats had just acknowledged what people were seeing with their own eyes, maybe they wouldn't have lost so much trust. Maybe they could have started rebuilding the connection with their base. But instead, they doubled down. They acted like voters were imagining things, like everything was perfectly fine. And this wasn't just a one-off mistake, it was a pattern. A party so focused on image and control that they forgot the people who put them in power in the first place. Sarah called it out right there on live TV, and you could see the tension build instantly. You could almost hear the producers in the background panicking, because what came next was going to be explosive. The other hosts weren't going to let that criticism slide not without a fight. That's when it got darker and a lot more serious. The conversation shifted from party image to what had actually been happening behind the scenes for the past 4 years. According to the accusations flying across the table, Joe Biden wasn't just an aging president with a few memory slips. He wasn't running the show at all. The people around him, Pelosi, Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, even Barack Obama allegedly knew he wasn't mentally fit, and they let it happen anyway. Think about that. Documents signed, laws passed, international meetings held, and nobody can say for sure if Biden understood what he was agreeing to. That's not just political drama. That's a complete breakdown of the office of the presidency. A man who once opposed gay marriage and school integration is suddenly leading the charge for progressive social changes. The hosts arguing against the cover-up said that shift didn't come from Biden himself. It was the party pulling the strings, using him as a puppet to push agendas he didn't even believe in. They even brought up the pride flags on the White House as a symbol, not because of what it represents socially, but because they believe Biden had no real say in it. It was all theater. A way to convince voters he was something he wasn't. The real Joe Biden, they claimed, was sidelined mentally, emotionally, and politically. And those in power didn't just allow it. They made it happen. Then came the part that sent chills through the entire room. While the media was busy telling Americans that Joe Biden was sharper than ever, world leaders weren't buying it. According to the argument, foreign adversaries like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping weren't fooled by the press releases or the late-night talk show appearances. They saw the truth up close and they acted on it. During Biden's time in office, the world didn't just shift, it unraveled. Russia invaded Ukraine. China became more aggressive toward Taiwan. Iran emboldened and unbothered backed attacks on Israel. These weren't just random events. The claim on the show was that these were calculated moves, made because enemy nations saw a weak, confused American president and decided it was the perfect time to strike. You can't lie to the world stage the same way you lie to a television audience. Biden's hesitation, his stumbles, his inability to complete a sentence, they saw it all. And according to the fiery back and forth on The View, this global chaos wasn't just unfortunate timing, it was the direct result of the Democratic Party's refusal to admit the truth. Keeping Biden in power, they argued, didn't just harm the US, it destabilized the entire planet. And when it was laid out like that, in front of a live audience, the stakes suddenly felt way higher than just winning or losing an election. This wasn't political theater anymore, this was about real consequences and real lives. But instead of facing those consequences, some of the hosts, especially Sunny, wanted to move on. Not just from the Biden conversation, but from the entire mess. Her focus shifted completely. She started listing off everything the Democratic Party should be talking about: fighting fascism, stopping Medicaid cuts, protecting pensions, saving education, and so on. But none of it addressed what the others were talking about. It was like two different conversations were happening at once. And that's what made it even more frustrating to watch. While Alyssa and Sarah were saying, "Hey, we've got to be honest about what happened," Sunny was rattling off buzzwords and acting like the past 4 years didn't need any examination. She even went on a wild tangent about how the Biden administration was prioritizing South African white refugees over Afghans and Ukrainians, to throw race into the discussion without any actual connection to what was being debated. This wasn't just deflection, it was denial on full display, and the more she talked, the clearer it became that she didn't want accountability. She wanted a reset. Forget the mistakes, forget the deception. Let's just focus on how to beat Trump. But that wasn't flying with the rest of the panel. You could feel the tension in the room like a rubber band about to snap. And what was about to happen next, especially between Sunny and Alyssa, would tear that band completely. That rubber band snapped the moment Sunny started calling for resistance. Not reform, not reflection resistance, but resistance to what exactly? That's what Alyssa pushed back on. The Democrats didn't control the House. They didn't control the Senate. And at least according to the criticism, they didn't even have a mentally present president in the White House. So what were they resisting? Sunny wasn't talking about policy plans or new leadership. She was calling for protests, confrontation, nonstop opposition. But opposition to whom? To what? Alyssa made it clear. They've already tried everything. The singing, the marching, the filibustering, the name-calling. They smeared, they lied, they staged, they shouted. And still they lost. So what's left? Here's where it got unsettling. Alyssa suggested that the only thing left in Sunny's playbook, whether she meant it or not, sounded like a call for chaos. Not because it made strategic sense, but because they refused to admit their own side screwed up. Democrats, she said, couldn't stomach the idea that they were wrong, that they'd made a mistake, that they weren't as virtuous or flawless as they claimed. So instead of saying, "Yeah, we put the wrong guy in office," they blamed the voters. They called the other side evil, racist, stupid. And it was easier to believe that than to admit they had lied to the American people for 4 years while the country fell apart. That's when Alyssa stopped playing nice. She looked right at Sunny and said what no one else on the panel wanted to say out loud: "Joe Biden is not mentally fit to be president." And the moment those words hit the air, the studio felt like it froze. Alyssa wasn't just throwing punches, she was unloading receipts. She reminded the panel that in 2023, 77% of Americans said Biden was too old to run again. Not Republicans, Americans. And instead of listening, the Democratic Party shut them down. They didn't open the floor to debate, they didn't run a fair primary. They just handed the nomination to Biden. Then, when that became impossible to defend, they quietly tried to shift the crown to Kamala Harris again with no democratic process. When Alyssa brought that up, Sunny muttered in the background that she didn't think it was wrong. Just like that. No explanation, no defense of democracy. Just open acceptance of bypassing the will of the people. Alyssa kept going. She said Biden had been at The View just last week. She didn't vote for him, but she still wanted to give him a chance to take responsibility. And for a brief moment, he admitted, "This falls on me." But one honest moment couldn't erase 4 years of cover-ups. And that was the heart of the issue, the refusal to admit fault, the refusal to say, "We got it wrong." And Sunny's flippant response only proved Alyssa's point. Then came the part that really shook the audience. Alyssa brought up a shocking detail from behind the scenes. At a high-profile fundraiser, Joe Biden didn't recognize George Clooney, one of the most famous faces on the planet. And sure, recognizing a movie star isn't a presidential duty, but if you can't recognize someone that famous, how are you supposed to respond in a crisis? How are you supposed to lead during a midnight call about war, terrorism, or cyber attacks? This wasn't just a funny gaffe, it was scary. Because if Biden couldn't identify Clooney at a calm, staged event, what did that say about his awareness when it really mattered? Joy Behar tried to spin it. She pulled out the old "but Trump is worse" card. She waved off every concern, every example of Biden's mental decline, by dragging the conversation back to January 6th, back to Trump's past mistakes, back to anything except what they were actually talking about. It was like she had a panic button, and every time the conversation got uncomfortable, she slammed it. But Trump! That response wasn't just weak, it felt insulting. The panel wasn't asking if Trump was perfect. They were asking why it was okay for Biden to lead the country for 4 years in a mental fog. And Joy's refusal to engage with that made it clear, for her and others like her, defending the party came before defending the truth. The moment Joy played the Trump is bad card for the 100th time, the entire discussion unraveled into chaos. Alyssa was done holding back. She pointed out the obvious. Comparing Biden's 4-year decline to one Republican mistake here or there wasn't even close to the same thing. One was about a bad decision. The other was about an unfit president being shielded by his entire party while the country suffered. And then she hit hard. Alyssa reminded everyone that this wasn't about spin or strategy, it was about delusion. The Democrats told voters they were the good guys, the smart ones, the moral ones. But while the economy tanked, cities became war zones, and foreign powers made bold moves, they kept telling Americans everything was fine. They convinced themselves that they couldn't possibly be wrong. And when voters pushed back, they blamed the people instead of asking if maybe their own actions were the problem. According to Alyssa and Sarah agreed this is why Trump won. Not because voters were fooled, not because of hate or ignorance, but because the Democrats refused to listen. They told Americans to sit down and follow the script while pretending Biden was sharp and capable. Meanwhile, the reality outside the bubble was burning. That refusal to look inward, to take any responsibility, created the very outcome they feared. But the party would rather believe the country is filled with idiots than face the truth. They lied, and the people noticed. And then it exploded into a full-on clash between Sunny and Alyssa. Sunny started throwing out claim after claim saying Trump lied to his base, that he promised not to tax overtime, that he tricked federal workers, farmers, immigrants. She went on and on, trying to paint the picture that Trump was the real reason America was broken. But Alyssa wasn't having it. She fired back immediately, correcting Sunny point by point. Trump did run on no taxes on tips, and it was in the new tax bill. Sunny tried to say it wasn't there originally, but Alyssa didn't let it slide. She stuck to the facts, calling out how these lies weren't coming from Trump, they were coming from the people who insisted he was the problem while ignoring everything else. Then Sunny threw out a wild argument. We have Trump because we were lied to. It was meant to sound deep, but it didn't land. Because if anything, the lies came from the Democratic Party pretending Joe Biden was fine when he clearly wasn't. They told the public he was strong, capable, the most experienced leader ever. But anyone watching him speak losing his place, forgetting names, wandering off knew something was wrong. And yet, instead of owning up to the deception, Sunny pushed a fantasy, one where voters were victims and the party did nothing wrong. But Alyssa and Sarah were done with fantasies. They were spelling out the real reason for the chaos denial. Plain and simple. As the dust settled from that shouting match, one thing became clear. Sarah and Alyssa weren't just upset about the past, they were warning about the future. They said the Democrats weren't learning anything. They were still ignoring the same voters who begged them to listen last time, still pushing the same unpopular ideas, like more government spending, open borders, biological men and women's sports, and endless DEI policies that a huge part of the country rejected years ago. And instead of changing course, they were doubling down, acting like nothing went wrong. Like their losing strategy was somehow going to win this time, as long as they just kept yelling louder about how evil Trump was. But Americans had already made it clear. They didn't want to be told what to care about. They didn't want lectures about identity and guilt. They wanted their voices heard, their problems taken seriously. Alyssa pointed out that while Trump highlighted issues people actually cared about like jobs, crime, border control, the Democrats told them to sit down and accept drag shows in schools and pride flags on every federal building. And when people pushed back, the party didn't ask why. They just screamed, "Fascism!" and blamed the other side for being too dumb to understand. But the more the Democrats ignored the reality outside their elite bubble, the further they drifted from everyday Americans. And as Alyssa said, if they kept it up, they were headed for another rude awakening. One they might not recover from. Before Alyssa's brutal CNN takedown, there was one more piece to this unraveling story, and it's the part that pulled back the curtain on what the Biden administration really exposed. Not just about Joe Biden himself, but about the Democratic machine that carried him into power and protected him at all costs. Alyssa and others on the panel argued that the past 4 years weren't just about hiding one man's cognitive decline. They were about revealing what the Democratic establishment truly stood for when no one was in their way. Without a strong president to check them, unelected officials, old Obama staffers, and bureaucratic insiders were free to run the show. And what they revealed was something a lot of Americans found terrifying. Policies that once would have been considered fringe or extreme were pushed straight into the mainstream. The border crisis exploded as millions poured in illegally. Entire cities were overwhelmed, but instead of solutions, the party gave speeches about compassion and diversity. Meanwhile, everyday Americans watch their schools fall apart, their neighborhoods become less safe, and their taxes go up while funding programs for people who didn't even live here legally. Cultural values were flipped upside down. Being proud of your country became a problem. Gender was turned into a costume. Children were exposed to things that even 10 years ago would have been unthinkable in a classroom. And if you pushed back, you were labeled a bigot, a threat, an enemy. Alyssa called it a mirror. With no real leadership at the top, the party finally showed the country what it would look like if they had total control. No balance, no restraint, just raw ideology. And in doing so, they alienated a huge part of the nation. Even lifelong Democrats began asking, is this really what we signed up for? This was no longer just about Joe Biden being unfit. That was the symptom. The real issue was the system that kept him propped up, while they ran wild with policies that reshaped the nation and not in a way most people wanted. That's why Alyssa and Sarah were so angry. Not just because the party lied, but because they showed their hand. And now they were hoping everyone would forget. Move on. Pretend it never happened. But not everyone's willing to forget. And that's where the final blow landed live on CNN. And just when you thought the firestorm was over, Alyssa dropped one final bomb this time, on CNN. She talked about The View's recent interview with Joe Biden, and it wasn't flattering. Alyssa had asked him directly about the growing concerns over his mental state. This was his chance to reassure the country, to prove he was still sharp, still capable. But instead of answering, Biden fumbled. He lost his train of thought. He drifted. He froze. And then Jill Biden, his wife, stepped in and answered for him. Alyssa didn't sugarcoat it. She said it looked like Jill wasn't just being a supportive spouse. She looked like his caretaker. This was supposed to be the moment where Biden showed strength, clarity, confidence. Instead, it turned into a moment that confirmed everything his critics had been saying. He couldn't even handle a simple question without being rescued. That moment hit Alyssa hard. She realized it wasn't just a rumor or partisan spin. Mental decline was real, and the party had been covering it up. She called it what it was, one of the most shameful political cover-ups in modern history. Because for over 200 years, the US had always had a functioning president until now. According to her, it wasn't Biden in charge. It was a team of unelected Obama-era staffers pulling the strings. And the scariest part? They knew exactly what they were doing. They just didn't care what it cost the country. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Also, drop your thoughts in the comments. See you on the next one.